I'm your host, Dane Johnson 3_16, aka Gravity, the man who has never met a mic he didn't like. And guys, there's no need to worry, because I am here with my first story from the big book of serial killers, an encyclopedia of serial killers. We have over 150 serial killers chronicled, and I am going to go through them randomly at my leisure for your entertainment. And we are going to start things off with Gerald Parker, aka the Bedroom Basher, or the Bludgeon Killer. Now, before we get started on him, this story, well, it doesn't just include the many victims that had succumbed to the Bedroom Basher, this evil man. It all started on September 30th. I'm going to tell you about an individual by the name of Kevin Green. Now, Kevin Green served 16 years in prison for the murder of his wife, and his wife was also pregnant at the time with their child, who of course obviously didn't make it. Now, that story starts on September 30th, 1979, when young Diana Green was struck and severely injured while in her apartment. Now, the blow to the head was so severe, she lost her ability to speak and otherwise communicate. So there was no way for this woman to communicate or tell law enforcement what had happened to her. She essentially went into a coma until she later passed away. She was transported to the hospital, where they did detect a heartbeat on the fetus. So at the time they thought, hey, this baby is going to make it. We're going to have a miracle baby here. But on September 30th later, that same day, it was determined that the fetus was going to be a stillborn. Now, Kevin Lee Green, who is Diana's husband, as I mentioned earlier, said he was not home at the time of the event. He testified that he had left the apartment. He went, of course, he wanted to go get some food. He went and grabbed a burger. And when he returned, he found his wife in a pool of blood, had been attacked. An employee at the hamburger stand even testified that Kevin Green was there. The burger in his possession was still warm, yet he was still arrested and convicted on October 2nd, 1980, after his wife, who had received a severe injury causing extensive brain damage, failed to testify against him. The entire case against Kevin resorted on the testimony of the victim, and there was a complete absence. There was no testimony. All the cops had was this guy came in and found his wife covered in blood, and so they arrested Kevin. He was found guilty by a jury of second-degree murder for the death of the unborn fetus and the attempted murder of his wife. So they're saying here now she didn't die. So we got conflicting stories here, guys. I do apologize. It's my first time. I'm kind of going on a bit of a whim, and I'm having fun with it, so we're going to live and learn as we go. The jury also found that the victim suffered great bodily injury during the commission of the crime, and the court sentenced Green to 15 years to life in state prison. So right away he's sentenced to 15 years for something he didn't even do. A minimum of 15 years of your life gone for something you didn't do. That's enough to make any man snap, if you ask me. I'd fucking lose my shit. So Green petitioned to the Supreme Court in the state of California for a hearing after the decision of the original appeal was denied. So after the conviction, So he's in prison, he's doing his own thing, he's hanging out, he's having a great time, right? Kevin Green loves prison. 16 years of his life. So I don't know if you guys know this, but there was a creation of the offender DNA database in California. Now, this is a DNA profiling system where, you commit a crime, you have to submit your DNA, they could run it, they could link you to other crimes. So this is where our actual serial killer comes into play here. So a guy spent 16 years of his life in prison for the death of his child that he had nothing to do with, and all those injuries to his wife, and it just so happened that she was a victim of what turned out to be a serial killer. So in October of 1999, Governor Gary Davis awarded Kevin Green $620,000 in compensation for the crimes he didn't commit, and he was set free. And this is where Gerald Parker enters the fray, the bedroom basher. His DNA linked him to not only that crime, but to an additional 5+ crimes. So this is where we get in to Gerald Parker. I just wanted to start with that little sidebar because I found it interesting, because I don't think, at least off the top of my head, I can't think of anybody else who had gotten out of prison or found innocent because a serial killer happened to be linked to these crimes. So now we're going to get into Gerald Parker, whose date of birth was 1955. I couldn't find an exact date for some reason. It seems to be a rare commodity to find when serial killers were actually born. But I will look up his horoscope before the end of this episode, hopefully anyway, and we'll go on from there. So his nicknames: the Bedroom Basher, or the Bludgeon Killer. Of course, every serial killer seems to have an awesome nickname. Like the Bedroom Basher does sounds pretty intense. So his characteristics: this guy would rape and home invade and leave you dead. His number of victims: he had 5+ victims. Now what made this guy unique is his crimes were all committed within the span of a year. So this guy committed all of his crimes in 1 year, leaving one hell of a path of destruction. So his date of arrest, like I said with the Kevin Green story, he was already in prison for a parole violation when DNA linked him to the killings. How he got his nickname? Well, his method of murder, obviously. He would bludgeon his victims with blunt objects. So this is a guy who, normally when you're a serial killer, when you're a killer, you bring a weapon to the crime. I'm not saying that this guy didn't bring something, but when you bludgeon someone to death, that to me says that there was probably something in the house that he grabbed. So maybe I just answered my question why he only lasted a year. He didn't seem to be very smart. He seemed to just kind of go for it. Maybe he saw people and just kind of went for it. Anyway, we're going to get into his known victims. We have Sandra K. Fry, who was 17 at the time. We have Kimberly Gay Rollins, who was 21 at the time. Marilyn K. Carlton, who was 31 at the time. Deborah Kennedy. She was 24 at the time. Oh, we have a Deborah Lynn Sr., who was 17 at the time, and of course the unborn child, who was going to be named Chantel Marie Green. That's intense, man. That's actually really intense. Kind of puts things into perspective, man. But anyway, these crimes, they were all located in the California state of California, I should say, and they were all in Orange County. So this is a guy who seemed to not go all that far. He stayed in the same area. He's sentenced to death, but he's awaiting execution. So as of this book being written, this man is still awaiting to be executed, don't you know? So let me tell you a little bit about this guy. Now, Parker was a former U.S. Marine who had a fairly clean criminal record until 1980. He had spent a period of time in juvenile detention in the 60s after being caught sniffing glue, of all things. Jesus. But he had stayed out of trouble from then onwards. Now, in 1980, he was stationed at the Marine Air Station in El Toro, California. And during this time, he had raped a 4-year-old girl and was quickly apprehended. He received a 6-year prison sentence for the crime, and a DNA sample was stored, as that was the protocol. And as time passed and technology advanced, it was this sample of DNA that would crack open the murder case, and further revelations from Parker himself would lead to the release of a man who had previously wrongly been convicted of a murder he never committed. And that is Kevin Lee Green, who I started our story with a little earlier. Now, let's talk a little bit about these murders. Now, Parker, of course, he was nicknamed the Bedroom Basher because of the ferocity of the sex attacks and murders he committed in the 1970s in the Orange County area. Between 1978 and 1979, 5 women were raped and murdered by Gerald Parker. Another woman, Diana D., formerly Green, was pregnant when she was attacked. Though she survived, her unborn child did not. And again, that's why I wanted to start with the Kevin Green stuff, because I feel like had I not started with that, you'd be interested in that, right? So, give a little context. I feel like Kevin Lee Green, he's a victim himself. Especially his own wife was so brutally attacked that she pointed the finger at him to say, hey, he did this. Like, I could only imagine. Now, let's get into the timeline of the murders. So, December 2nd, 1978 was when Sandra K. Fry, who was 17 at the time, was murdered. Now, April 1st, 1979, Kimberly Rollins, who is 21, that is her date of murder, is what it's telling me here. Now, it gets a little interesting, because I want you to see if you notice this. Now, September 14th, 1979, Mary Carlton, 31, she dies. Now, September 30th, 1979, the unborn child, of course, dies. Kevin Lee Green's unborn daughter. The crime he didn't commit, but spent 16 years of his life in prison for. And then we jump to October 7th, where Deborah Kennedy, who was 24, was murdered. And October 21st, 1979, Deborah Lynn Sr., who was 17 at the time. So I want to go back real quick here to this first murder, because that's December 2nd, 1978. Now we wait all the way until April of 1979 before he commits the second one. Now we jump to September 14th. And what's interesting about this is the attack. The next attack was September 30th. And if you look, like, that's a span of 2 weeks. So it's like after that September 14th one, I feel like all bets were off. Like this guy was just like going ham here because he went September 14th, then on the 30th, where of course Deborah Lynn Sr. She should have, of all things, she should have died. So like that's just crazy. And then of course on the 7th and 21st of October, like again, like this guy wasn't waiting. So had he not been caught, I feel like there's other murders this guy's probably committed. If you look at that span of timeline, he was kind of unhinged there towards the end. But anyway, we're going to get into the arrest and the trial. Now, when Parker was linked to these murders through the DNA technology, he was already in prison for his other convictions, of course, which was the rape of a 4-year-old girl. Go figure, fucking sick freak. When investigators showed him in the evidence, he confessed to being the bedroom basher. He went to trial. In October of '98, he was convicted of 6 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of attempted murder, and 6 counts of first-degree rape. Parker was sentenced to death in January of '99. He also received life plus 64 years. Makes sense. Now, the outcome. The father of the unborn baby that was killed, Kevin Green, was initially arrested and charged with the attack of his wife, which resulted in the loss of the baby. Because the baby was full term, Kevin Green was charged and convicted of the murder and sent to prison for 17 years before it was discovered that Parker was actually the attacker. And of course, I gave context to that story in the beginning. So, my thought, let's get into some thoughts here on this, right? Just need like a second, because this is the first one that we're doing, but I just have a weird feeling that the whole U.S. Marine, not even U.S. Marines, I shouldn't say U.S. Marines, I should just say like in general, military backgrounds are people in law enforcement. It's just crazy. It's just, when you think of that sort of thing, like all these people, well, what do you have when you're in the military or when you have, in law enforcement? So you're just very like punctual. Like I feel like you could just be, like it just seems to line up, like the serial killer trade, like guys like Dahmer, guys like Gacy, who we're gonna get into, but it just like there just seems to be so many of them that had that sort of background. But they also in the military, they seem to be like the grunt kind of guys. Like they weren't anybody special. They weren't anybody in particular. They're just grunts. And then after they got out and they just took it out on everybody. Like they couldn't cope in a real world, and I feel like that happens a lot. And I feel like that's why today especially, like there's all these programs for the military and veterans and things like that, because man, you go from a high strung position like that to where every day is, I'm not saying this guy fought, but in the 60s, you kind of got to think he did, or even in the 70s and 80s. I guess not in the 60s. Fuck, the guy was born in 55. And I'd be interested to find out about his dad. Like, this stuff wasn't really in depth on the families and stuff like that. So I'd like to look into that a little bit. But I just find it really interesting, like a guy like Kevin Green spends 16 years in prison. And now that I see a photo of this guy, I honestly remember watching an episode of this. I don't know if you guys ever were into it, but there's a wicked Canadian TV show, like Forensic Files. That was really dope. And like a big part of that was like the all the forensics, like the DNA. It's just very, very awesome how that all comes about. And unfortunately, I wanted to get into the victims a little bit more, but you know, obviously we can't because there's not much here. And I know I'm kind of like rambling a little bit, but that's because I'm just quickly doing a bit of a Google search on Kevin Green to see if there's any new news about him. Because I like to leave you guys with some tidbits and stuff like that. But, well, all I could tell you, I guess, is, he was free due to the Innocence Project, which is awesome. That's something you guys should look up. Maybe one day we'll get into that, but we'll save that for another time. So, again, some episodes will be longer than others. It all depends on what I can find on said killer. My knowledge about them. A lot of these guys I have done a little bit of research on, but like I said, there are 150 that we're going to touch base on. And we'll see what we'll get into next time. Some of these serial killers, they've never been caught. Some of these serial killers have just 3 victims. Some of these serial killers have over 300. Some are necrophiliacs. Others, well, they'd shoot you from over 100 yards away and, run into a back alley. Like the methods, the different mindsets of these guys and girls is crazy. And again, I couldn't find the horoscope on this guy offhand. So before I do the next episode, I'll definitely remind myself and hit you guys up with that. But hey, it's been your boy Dane Johnson 3_16, aka Gravity, the man who has never met a mic he didn't like. And you ain't gotta worry, because soon there will be another story. Ladies and gentlemen, take care, stay safe, eat your cereal, but don't be a